When you think about the German Navy in the 1940s, you probably think of a few ships: Bismarck, Scharnhorst, Prinz Eugen, or Tirpitz. These are famous ships and big names for various reasons. However, that very fame tends to obscure the rest of the surface navy. So today's video will look at one of those forgotten ships, in the form of the cruiser Koln, one of Germany's first new light cruisers. This ship is typically overlooked compared to others. Nonetheless, the cruiser gave good service for over a decade, in peace and at war, and continued to fight even after sinking in port. So with that in mind, let's cover Koln's story in this video. A story that began when she was laid down on August 7th, 1926, as the third and final member of the new Königsberg-class, and Koln would be the final member in more ways than one. The cruiser would launch on May 23rd, 1928, which was followed by the commissioning on January 15th of 1930. A little under 4 years of work for a new cruiser, which is a good point to talk about the design, since this was a new ship for a new navy. First off, this was a light cruiser in the truest sense of the word, displacing only 6,100 tons at the standard displacement. This rose to 7,800 tons when the ship was fully loaded. Now for the weaponry. This consisted of 3 triple turrets carrying 15cm or 5.9-inch guns, for a total of 9 barrels, admittedly in a bit of an odd layout, consisting of a single bow turret and 2 stern turrets in an offset layout, which gave the cruiser a bit of a lopsided look from the stern angle. These were supported by 2 single 88mm anti-aircraft guns. Those would quickly be replaced by twin mounts to bring the total to 4 barrels, with a third twin mount added later, bringing it up to 6 guns in all. These were, in turn, supported by 37mm and 20mm cannon, ultimately coming out to 8 37mm guns and 18 20mm cannon. To round off the weaponry, the cruiser also carried 12 21-inch torpedo tubes, and 4 triple launchers, 2 to a side. These were clustered around the amidships superstructure, although they began as 20-inch torpedoes before swapping to the larger model in 1934. Koln also carried 120 mines in a secondary role as a mine layer. Armor protection, meanwhile, was very thin. The armor belt was only 50mm or 2 inches thick at its maximum. The deck was even thinner at 40mm or 1.6 inches. And with that covered, all that's left is speed, which came out to 32 knots on 65,000 shaft horsepower, with a mix of diesel engines and traditional steam turbines through 2 shafts. And with that, we've reached the end of the design details. Now we can talk service. This began, as said earlier, when the ship commissioned on January 15th, 1930. Although before Koln could properly enter service, she had to perform sea trials. Those began in July of 1930 after further finishing up work. From there, the trials ran through October of 1930. No major issues cropped up during this process, although the cruiser did swap her 88mm guns during the trials. That said, Koln's service didn't really change much after her sea trials, at least not at first. For the rest of 1930 through to late 1932, it was more training, from gunnery practice to port visits. This only changed to any real extent in August of 1932. On August 12th, Koln left Germany. She wouldn't return for over a year as the ship and crew set out on a world cruise, ranging from the Mediterranean to the Far East, including Australia, which is interesting. First, because the cruiser visited several ports, and during this, the crew participated in multiple football games, or soccer for the Americans in the audience. This included going up against an Australian Navy team in Sydney. We actually have a surviving photograph of the teams dated to May 10th of 1933. The condition is rough, but it remains an interesting look, at a time that doesn't get much attention or coverage. Now the other notable part was a visit to Rabaul in New Britain. This had been a German colony until it was handed to Australia after the Great War. This visit was, as a result, the first visit by a German cruiser since the Empire fell. There's an interesting article on this that I'll link in the description. In any event, after that visit, Koln shifted north. She would visit China and Japan before turning home. This saw another transit of Suez and visits to Italy, Greece, and Spain, before the cruiser arrived back in Germany on December 12th of 1933. When this was done, it was back to training, which is, to be fair, what Koln spent most of her peacetime career doing. This time it would last from 1934 through to 1936, with a couple breaks for a refit breaking the monotony. For instance, in 1935, where the cruiser gained a pole mast on the stern, along with a catapult to support floatplanes. Otherwise, nothing much of note. Until, that is, Spain erupted into civil war in 1936. This would see Koln join the non-intervention patrols off the Spanish coast. The cruiser would have seen British, French, Italian, and American ships doing much the same. Those patrols were very much a multinational affair, although each country involved had differing goals. In Koln's case, not much of note happened on these patrols. The cruiser would patrol off Spain from June 1936 through to the end of 1937, during which the Deutschland incident occurred. Republican bombers hit the Panzerschiffe Deutschland on May 29, 1937. This killed 31 sailors and wounded 74. At least some of those wounded men were brought back home aboard Koln before the cruiser returned to Spain, until returning home to Germany again in January 1938, at which point it was back to her previous training duties, at least until late 1939 when war broke out. The only notable events prior to this being the occupation of Memel in March 1939, and a series of maneuvers in the Atlantic during the summer of 1939. When the Second World War arrived, however, Koln was at home. She wasn't sent out as a raider like the Panzerschiffe. Instead, the cruiser was stationed in the Baltic to catch fleeing Polish vessels on September 1st, which was not successful, let's say. Multiple Polish vessels would escape the fall of their nation. After operations in the Baltic were complete, Koln shifted to the North Sea. This saw her lay minefields from September 3rd to September 20th, and support other ships doing the same duty. When that was done, the cruiser joined Gneisenau on October 7th. The Germans sortied towards Norway, but not to fight. This was a distraction intended to draw British attention from merchant raiders. It did, admittedly, succeed in getting the British focus. However, neither side would encounter the other than ineffective air attacks. The rest of 1939 would be quiet for the most part, just 2 escort missions. First, on November 20th, when Koln and Leipzig escorted the Scharnhorst twins into the North Sea. This also saw an unsuccessful hunt for Allied shipping on November 22nd through November 25th. After that failed hunt, there was a second escort mission on December 13th of 1939, where Koln joined Nuremberg and Leipzig in meeting up with 5 destroyers. The cruisers were supposed to escort the destroyers. However, a British submarine had something to say about that plan. HMS Salmon managed to hit both Leipzig and Nuremberg, thus changing it to the destroyers escorting the damaged cruisers, with Koln in support. After this, there was nothing of note until the invasion of Norway in April of 1940. Koln would support the German invasion, including bombarding Bergen. The cruiser would escape any damage during these operations, unlike her unfortunate sister ships. Both of those were sunk during the Norwegian campaign. Koln, meanwhile, returned to Germany for refit. This saw the ship gain a helicopter landing platform on top of her superfiring turret. Using that, the cruiser would test the Flettner FL-282. Unfortunately, there's a lack of surviving photos from that testing. Even so, it's an interesting topic. However, the rest of the cruiser's career would be less interesting. Late 1941 was spent in the Baltic, supporting operations against the Soviets. This saw Koln join Tirpitz in patrolling against the Soviet fleet on September 23, 1941, and from there bombarding islands, from the Gulf of Riga to Estonia. During this, the cruiser was attacked by a Soviet submarine on October 13th. Or at least an attempt was made, but it was chased off by escorting destroyers. After that, the cruiser went in for another refit, which included the fitting of a radar set. This refit lasted into May of 1942. It wouldn't be until July, specifically July 9th, that Koln returned to service. This saw the cruiser return to mine-laying as she sailed to Norway, where she remained until September 13th of 1942. This saw an attempted action against convoy PQ-18. Attempted because, ultimately, the German fleet held back, letting the Luftwaffe and the U-boats do the job. Koln returned to Norway, where she would remain until 1943. She didn't join the Battle of the Barents Sea in December 1942, and that operation succeeded in only one thing: getting most of the surviving German surface fleet decommissioned or put on training duty. In this case, including Koln. The cruiser left Norway on January 23, 1943, and arrived back in Germany on February 8th, where she was decommissioned in Kiel on February 17th for the rest of the year. It wouldn't be until 1944 that the cruiser returned to even limited service, at least aside from dockside training of cadets. This came in April of 1944 when Koln went in for a refit, which concluded on July 1st when the cruiser returned to training duty. This lasted until September 1944 when Koln began mine-laying in Norwegian waters. This would, as it turned out, be her last notable mission. The cruiser shifted to convoy escorts until she was bombed in port on December 13th, 1944. This damaged the propulsion system and required repair work, which would take place in early 1945, although the damage was never fully repaired. That being because repeated bombing raids kept on adding to the damage, until Koln was ultimately sunk in Wilhelmshaven on March 30th, 1945. However, her guns remained above water and the crew remained aboard. They would use the turrets as stationary artillery to protect the city, at least until the war came to a close on May 8th of 1945. The cruiser was surrendered with the rest of the German fleet and partially scrapped in place, before being raised and scrapped completely in 1956. Admittedly, not the most exciting career, but I think it's an interesting one, from the world cruise to the helicopter testing. Thank you for watching. Remember to like, comment, and subscribe if you enjoy the content, and I'll see you in the next one.